Greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So, behind me is what was the establishment, this building here, with a black awning, which was a comedy club, and really the first comedy club in the United Kingdom. So far as I know, actually the first comedy club in the world. There are plenty of nightclubs with a bit of cabaret, which would include a bit of comedy, but this one was solely devoted to comedy. And yes, they served drinks, not that they served meals. I don't think there was any dancing, a little bit of music just to kind of introduce the acts and all the rest of it. But apart from that, it was all about the comedy. And so the establishment was set up in 1961 by Peter Cook. He was from a family of distinguished colonial civil servants. And he went to Radley College, which is one of the UK's top schools, probably in the top 20, just south of Oxford, where he didn't fit in with the chauvinism, the machismo, the fixation with sport and so on. He was more bookish. He was already cynical, if not to say sardonic, and rather anti-authority. So this was really to set the pattern for the rest of his life. He then went to Oxford University, did a degree in French and German, which tells you something about his verbal felicity. So he'd obviously mastered a couple of foreign tongues and was certainly master of his own, which is why he can be very witty, very verbally inventive and so forth. So almost straight after coming down from Oxford, he set up the Establishment Club, and the historian A.J.P. Taylor had just coined the expression the establishment, a word which has obviously really entered the English language all over the world. We all know what it means. But in this country at the time, what did it mean? I suppose it meant the royal family, the armed forces, particularly the officer corps, the Church of England, maybe the BBC, the big corporations, certainly the Conservative Party, the judiciary, and on and on and on. So the upper class, that was the establishment, which was a vague but comprehensible expression. And he was very anti-establishment, which is why it was one of his countless ironies that he called the club the establishment, as it's going to be a thorn in the side of the powers that be. And he came along at the right time. That really was just perfect, because the Lord Chamberlain's department was no longer censoring theatre, especially comedy. Up until that time, if you wished to perform for the stage, you had to submit your script to the Lord Chamberlain's department, and they would watch it. They would not just read the script, but also view the performance to see that there were no vulgar gestures or anything like that. And anything they thought was unacceptable, they had to underline in blue, hence the expression blue jokes. As in something that was risque. Like the BBC at the time, they had a rule that comedy had to exclude anything about politics, sex, religion, or the royal family. Now, the best jokes would include all four of those elements. No wonder there was so much racist humor around, because that was one of the few things left. But anyway, he came here and he was taking aim at the royal family, at the BBC, at the upper class in general, and he spoke with an upper middle class accent, but he would sometimes parody this the advanced RP accent that a lot of people spoke with at the time, army officers, people like that, judges. He famously, in 1979, that June, he did his biased judge sketch. Right before he went on stage, they were talking about homosexuals. It's to do with the Jeremy Thorpe trial. Did Jeremy Thorpe arrange for the murder of his ex-boyfriend? A murder didn't actually happen, but was a conspiracy to murder. Anyway, about gays, and there was a lot of anti-gay sentiment in the 70s, and what are gays called? Right before Peter Cook went on, Billy Connolly said, when in Glasgow they call it playing the pink oboe, being gay. So he managed to work that into his script straight away, going on as a judge who was extraordinarily prejudiced towards the defendant, Jeremy Thorpe. So really skewering that judge. I don't remember his name actually. Was it Justice Cantley? Trying to skew the trial towards Jeremy Thorpe and saying, you know, he's one of the best and one of the prettiest politicians around for some time, whereas his accuser is a self-confessed player of the pink oboe. And so that word entered the English language. So he performed here, and one time Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister, decided to show his sport and come along. It was a very deferential era. People were still tugging the forelock to the upper classes. I mean, Macmillan, he wasn't that upper class, as he liked to emphasise his great-grandfather being a crofter, when actually he lied, said it was his grandfather, it wasn't. And his family had Macmillan Books, a very successful publishing house, going to this day. He married the Duke of Devonshire's daughter. He'd been a King's Scholar at Eton. He'd been to Oxford, Balliol College, been elected president of the Oxford Union, not actually served, but been an officer in the Grenadier Guards, had really impeccable establishment credentials. So he was used to people being deferential towards him, but he went along and he expected a little bit of humour. But anyway, Peter Cook was on stage and he mercilessly mimicked the voice and the mannerisms of Harold Macmillan, who was sitting there right there in the front row, who was shrinking in his seat, not knowing what to do, because he was not accustomed to this at all. It was really groundbreaking stuff, and some people thought cruel to a rather old man. But he'd put himself in the firing line for it, and Peter Cook, he had a lot of gripes about the establishment. He was straight himself, but he disliked these anti-gay laws. He was against the death penalty. He was for decolonisation. As Peter Cook acidly said, the reason he didn't become a colonial governor is because Britain had run out of colonies by the time he graduated. And he didn't like compulsory military service. So far as I'm aware, he didn't do national service. In those days, all boys had to do a couple of years with either the Army, the Royal Navy, or the RAF. Anyway, so he was straight, but I don't think he ever married, actually. He was a big-time boozer, and he used to smoke like a chimney. Obviously not terribly good for his health. Still performing into the 90s. He had a comedy partnership with Dudley Moore, whom we met at Oxford, this very short guy with a club foot who was extraordinarily musically gifted. Dudley Moore came from a very different background, came from a working class family, and despite his precocious intelligence and his musical talents, his family gave Dudley Moore absolutely no encouragement whatsoever. Nevertheless, he won a scholarship to Magdalen College, Oxford, where he got to know Peter Cook, and they did their Pete and Dud sketch of two proletarian men. I think it's feeble, actually. But anyway, they were on television a lot in the early 60s. Bear in mind there were only two television channels in the UK at the time, BBC and ITV. So if you were ever on television those days, even once, you were instantly famous. So there it was in this underground place, the Establishment Club, but it didn't last very long, even though it really did push the boundaries of comedy, of taste and decency, and it broke ground for which we can all be grateful for these days. Commercially, it wasn't a success and folded after only 2 years. Now, rents were much more reasonable in London in those days. This is Soho, which is part of the West End, I suppose, theatre district. It's also the gay village, is also the red light district. So got that seedy reputation, but it needed to be edgy, I suppose, because the population of London was falling. People who had evacuated in the Second World War, some of them never come back. Buildings had been bombed out. London was only just been rebuilt completely by 1961. So that's why he set up here. And as I say, the business folded. But he stayed in comedy, was very prominent till his sudden death in 1995. That was him. A willowy figure, always waspish, certainly a gadfly so far as the establishment was concerned. And part of that comedy revolution of the early 60s, he knew Monty Python, was good friends of theirs, wasn't actually a member of Monty Python. He cooperated with the two Ronnies, Ronnie Corbett, Ronnie Barker, a little bit as well. All right, that's enough about Peter Cook and the establishment.